Hello everyone, welcome to my presentation on the arraignment and burning of Margaret Ferneseed. To begin, here's a summary of what happens in the pamphlet. I will say, as a warning, that some of the details get a little grotesque, but I don't foresee that being a problem with the people in this class given everything we've read this semester. So, Margaret Ferneseed was arrested for the murder of her husband Anthony, whose body was found in Peckham Field near Lambeth. Margaret was described by the public as being given to all the looseness and lewdness of life, which either unlawful lust or abominable prostitution could violently cast upon her with the greatest infamy. Meanwhile, Anthony was described as sober and of very good conversation. Anthony was found with his throat cut, a knife in his hand, gold rings upon his fingers, and 40 shillings in money in his purse. A few notable things about his body. First of all, he had gold rings on his fingers and he had money in his pocket, so this probably wasn't a robbing. But also, Anthony had been dead for quite a while at this point. His body was decomposing. It was infested with maggots, suggesting that he had died not overnight. And that's important to note because witness testimony says that the field where he was found was empty the day before. So logically, he would have had to been killed elsewhere, left for a while to start the decomposition process, and then he was moved to the field overnight. So nobody was able to identify Anthony at first, but they discovered an indenture on his body, noting that a youth was in service to him. The servant was identified, and then identified the body as Anthony and gave investigators information about where he lived. As people arrived at their home to tell Margaret the news of her husband, she behaved in a manner that showed carelessness or indifference. And also suspiciously, before the method of death could have been announced, she declared that it was he who cut his own neck. Very suspicious. So she did travel to Peckham to see Anthony's body, and while she was there, she met with one of her husband's acquaintances and began speaking of her misfortune, and that she had lost a most honest and good husband. She ran into another acquaintance shortly after and began explaining her grief in exchange for pity. However, this acquaintance pointed out her seemingly indifferent emotional reaction to Anthony's death, saying that if they were in the same situation, they would be crying their eyes out. Margaret's excuse? Her eyes are ill, and she needs to preserve them in order to be able to make clothes. So, very suspicious behavior right off the bat. So, Margaret's story, for the most part, remained consistent, and therefore she did not raise any suspicion until the servant was questioned. And he stated that, quote, since her marriage to his master, she had lived in all disquietness, rage, and distemperature, often threatening his life and contriving plots for his destruction. The servant explained that after the two of them had married, she has been publicly seeing a young man and often committing adultery with him. Even before Anthony's death was known, she had sold all of his goods to pursue her lover, and all of this was backed up by statements from the neighbors, and so Margaret was taken in for even more questioning. And during this examination, Margaret did not deny any of the statements, but she stayed firm in her denial that she was responsible for her husband's death. So, following this, she was imprisoned while awaiting trial, and her behavior in prison did not paint her in the best of light. She was very open in conversations, and she was described as a bawd, so a woman in charge of a brothel. So, more information about what Margaret has been up to starts coming to light. So, in her trial, she was charged with the murder of Anthony, and she pleaded not guilty. Several witnesses spoke against her in the trial, speaking of the scandalous happenings of her life and stating that she once tried to poison her husband with broth. Her lack of care after his death was also mentioned, as well as the selling of her husband's goods and her adulterous relationship with her lover. And they also eventually had the testimony of two sailors who stayed at the home who overheard Margaret and Anthony speaking, in which Anthony was pleading that Margaret change her ways, and when she refused, he left the room. But then he heard the sailors and went to investigate and asked them who they were and why they were in his house. And the sailors inquired about who he was, and he explained that he was the master of the house, but was under control of a, quote, devilish woman, and then explained Margaret's actions. And when the sailors told Margaret that her husband had said all this, they reported her saying, quote, I will be before God, be revenged of him, by one means or other, so work that I will be rid of him. So, based on all of this evidence, she was sentenced to death through burning and was returned to prison to await execution. And during this time, she gave a confession to God and sought repentance, explaining that, quote, in her youth, even from the age of aptness, she had been a prostitute, whore, but growing into disabled years. To plead the loose desires of such customers, she after turned bawd, a course of life more hateful in tempting and seducing youth than the other in committing sin. So, she confessed that she retained several women at her home, some who were married, who worked for her brothel, essentially. Some were persuaded to work for her. She told them that her husbands did not love for them, or that their husbands were not caring for them aptly, and got these women to come do prostitution for her. And then once they started working for her, she would blackmail them and tell them that she would tell their husbands if they did not give her 10 shillings a week from their profits. So she admitted guilt for prostitution, for opening a brothel, but she still kept her innocent plea for the murder of Anthony. Finally, on the last Monday in February, she was informed that she would be executed that afternoon. A preacher urged her to confess for the sake of her soul, but she continued to deny being the murderer, and around 2 p.m., she was led to the stake, fastened to it, and burned. And even at this point, she still asserted her innocence until she was finally dead. So here's a little background information on the pamphlet. So while the author of the pamphlet is unknown, it was printed for a Henry Gosson, and was published in 1608, and was to be sold at, quote, the Sign of the Sun in Paternoster Row. Paternoster Row, I believe I'm saying that right, is a street in London, and at the time was a center of publishing in the city, and so they had a bunch of booksellers on that street. According to records, Margaret was born in 1560, so she was 48 at the time of her death. And records also confirm that her execution date was February 28th, 1608. And most back up the story with the information given during her prison confession, especially information surrounding her enlisting girls into prostitution and blackmailing them to continue working for her. So all of that is reported to be true. I think the most notable thing about this case is that, according to her confession, she was guilty of various crimes. Prostitution, adultery, blackmail, all things that were punishable in the 17th century. But there was very little evidence that could link her to the murder of Anthony. Ken McMillan notes that there was little evidence proving that Margaret Ferneseed murdered her husband, which was the crime for which she was convicted and executed. Although Ferneseed confessed to running a bawdy house, corrupting many maids and married women, being a receiver of stolen goods, and committing adultery, all of which were crimes in their own right, she was adamant right up to the brink of death that she was innocent of her husband's murder, which was proven, quote, proven, using solely circumstantial evidence. So Margaret's conviction was almost entirely based on the poor reputation that she had amongst neighbors, as well as her behavior, which was against the norms of what women in 17th century England were expected to follow. Macmillan goes on to note that rather than being a good neighbor and a submissive and modest wife, Ferneseed breached nearly every gender, sexual, and social boundary used to maintain order in early modern England. For these reasons, even if the evidence linking her to Anthony Ferneseed's death was sketchy, Margaret Ferneseed had to be executed so that balance could be restored. And this highlights how the criminal justice system of the time was used to maintain social behavior boundaries, even if the morality and legality of the practice was questionable. In her book on the news reporting of 17th century murder pamphlets, Elisabetta Ciccone also highlights the way the system was used against women, stating that what is striking is the disjunction between the predominant gender-based representation of the murderer as unnatural wife or pitiless mother, and real statistics on domestic homicide, which show that the murder of wives by husbands was at least twice as common as the reverse in the early modern period. Through the use of murder pamphlets, authors showed female agency as the gravest manifestation of a world turned upside down, showing society's fear of changes to the established hierarchies. Additionally, murder pamphlets were a cheap tool for spreading religious indoctrination, allowing people to spread further fear of those who did not subscribe to the religious beliefs of the time. While it is clear that if the records are correct, Margaret Ferneseed was a morally corrupt woman who profited off of and exploited women who were trapped in an abusive cycle. However, based on the evidence presented and witness testimony, there was no concrete evidence that she was responsible for the murder, especially since the most damning testimony, that of the sailors, came after she was already sentenced to death. As part of my own personal analysis of the case, knowing that Anthony's body was moved to the field where he was found long enough after his death that there was significant decomposition, but seemingly overnight, as people claimed that the field was empty just the day before, we have to assume that Margaret killed him, kept him somewhere for a while before dumping his body in a field in the dead of night. If this had been the case, she would have most likely needed a way to transport the body, as for my understanding, he was found a ways from home. And additionally, she would have to lift the body, which I can assume would have been quite heavy, though perhaps Anthony was very thin and she was very strong. We don't know those details. The other possibility is that she had help, likely from a man, to do the heavy lifting for her, but knowing Margaret's tendency to abuse others for her own benefit, if she had had an accomplice, she likely would have pinned the murder on them, as she was an exceptionally manipulative woman. The only other thing I can think of is if it was her lover and she truly did love him and wanted to protect him, so she took on all the blame herself. But given this analysis, I cannot say that I am convinced that she is guilty of the murder, though definitely still a suspect. But definitely a more thorough investigation would be needed. Thanks for listening to my presentation. Here are my works cited. There was actually a lot of information about this particular murder pamphlet. So if murder pamphlets are your thing, go check it out. It was pretty interesting. Anyways, thank you again, and have a great day.